Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Warning, 2
Yes,
minutes
affirmative.
remaining.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Warning, 1 minute remaining.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have
Acknowledged.
arrived.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged.
Awaiting
Affirmative.
orders.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Mission saved.
Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Comrade, acknowledged. Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Comrade. Waiting order. Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Mission saved.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Mission saved.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Mission saved.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Waiting for acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Waiting for acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Let's keep going.
Affirmative.
Mission saved.
Let's get rid of remaining
Affirmative.
enemies.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes.
Very well. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
What the fuck are you doing?
Acknowledged.
Shoot it.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Go on.
Acknowledged.
Shoot that thing.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Why the fuck's it going around?
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Do this then.
Reporting. Affirmative. Agreed.
Actually,
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
get
Affirmative. Affirmative.
that.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Agreed.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Mission saved.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Let's
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
all across here.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.